Good evening, everybody. It's a pleasure to welcome you all from different regions, in the world to our today's webinar, the third webinar of our series of out of 4, on behalf of Signant Health. Today we will share more details about decentralized clinical trials in the real world, and also we'll give you a quick overview about Signant Health. But as you can see here on the screen, I have already some poll questions to you. If you could answer them, it would be great, so that we can use this for our discussions throughout this webinar. So let's maybe wait for another minute from some more participants. And again, if you can respond to the poll questions, it would be great. You can find it in the chat, the link. So I would say, let's go to the next slide. Yes, perfect, thank you. So it's great, yeah, so thank you for responding. That's good information that we really know, which direction you're going, you went already, and what's important for you. So we will take this into account, of course, people who just joined, if you can also provide your feedback, it would be fantastic. And then we can, as I said, use it for our conversations throughout of the webinar. So, okay, perfect, thank you. Let's go to the next slide, please. So again, welcome to this webinar today. As I said, it's the third webinar out of 4 of our series here. And really want to talk about, decentralized clinical trials in the real world, that everybody's talking about it. So we will, share, some insight from Signant Health, how we see that the topic. And we will have also further poll questions later on. You will see them, on the slide, but if you can respond to that, it would be great. That would be very valuable. Next slide, please. Some housekeeping, I mentioned already the poll questions. That's great. If you have additional questions, please feel free, add them into the Q&A panel. We will monitor them and we'll have at the end the Q&A session to go back to them. And if there's not enough time, we will come to back individually to everybody, really answering those slides, those questions, as soon as possible. And it would be nice if you please stay on mute, and also at the end of the day, at the end of this webinar, we'll have also a post-event survey. This is important because we want to always improve. If you can give us your feedback, how you see that would be very highly appreciated. So with that, let's go to the next slide. So we have today 3 more people than me. My name is Günther Martin. I'm, the Senior Director for Business Development in the DACH region in Eastern Europe. And I have, 3 colleagues. We have Davi Wessels, our Chief Medical Officer, Bill Byram, VP for Product Acquisition and Intelligence, as well as my colleague, Emil Höck, also Senior Director Business Development. Everybody will contribute to this webinar today. I'm really looking forward to every individual session of my colleagues today. But before we start that, let me maybe start with some introduction to Signant Health, just an overview who we are, where we're coming from. So if you go please to the next slide here, just to give you a quick overview, there's a lot of experience in our organizations throughout the last 20 years. What we gathered, our goal is really to generate high quality data for your clinical trials. And that comes, in operational, clinical areas, scientific and regulatory expertise. And that's why we have also our Chief Medical Officer here today, that he can also talk about, the importance, of our scientific expertise, in our organization. And that's important to link, really to combine, the evidence generation or IP and delivery of every study, that you get the best out of every study, get the best quality data in that area. And what we're providing is, validated solutions, validated software and expertise, so that you really, we can run your, flexible trials. We can help you design those trials right in a very early stage, starting with scientific services, but then going also into the technology and solution side. And at the end of the day, it's really the goal from our side is to make sure that, our customers, they can integrate, converge and unify our solutions to get the best value out of the solution, the best value for their study. That's really what we're offering here. And if you go to the next slide, please, that's where you can see the expertise. On one side, it's important to have technology and software, but the expertise throughout thousands of clinical trials. So you see here, our strong, our experience comes from all the different therapeutic areas that we're supporting. We have performed clinical trials. We see also a trend, that we get more and more phase 1, trials in the market. But our solutions are used throughout all of the phases in every clinical trial. And here on the right-hand side, you can see, that we performed, thousands of clinical trials, all across the world, different languages, and so it's important that you see that you can combine really this expertise with the technology. And with that, you will see that in our next slide here is really that we have an end-to-end solution. If you can please switch to the next slide, is what we're offering is an end-to-end solution for the complete patient data journey. And that starts with site initiation, where we can help you with remote site inspection services and technology like classes like Google Class, where you can use that for your site initiation. But then typically you start your clinical trial with e-consent. And we know that different countries have different rules, and we have a lot of experience in that area. And please consult us if you want to have more deeper conversation with that one, so we can help you to find the right modality in that area. And also medication is getting, direct medication is getting more and more common in the market. We have complete solution in that area as well. And the next point is eQA. So we, our services team and our solution team will help you to find the right modality, for your clinical trial. What you're looking for based on your protocol, and using either BYOD or any other modality. That's one of the strengths in that area, of course. And another trend, what we see that we discussed in one of our previous webinars, is there's a trend using more and integrate more sensors and wearables. So we have a lot of experience in that area. Please also reach out to us if you want to share, what you're looking for, what you want to integrate, combine that with eQA, etc. We can do that. Two more topics here, clinical ratings. So that, again, we have our chief medical officer here, our scientific team, who can help you to, find the right raters, to train the raters, that you get the best quality out of your clinical trial. And two more topics, telemedicine. That's an area of today's meeting, of course. We talk about decentralized trials. That's what we do, since a long time already. And the last but not least, when you go to the end of your clinical trial, that you have also services, to close out, your clinical trial, the study. You see a complete end-to-end solution here, and you can pick and choose what's relevant for you, and then you can start and you can onboard other solutions, throughout the study or later on for other studies. So I hope this was useful here to get kind of an overview about Signant Health. And if we can go to the next slide, please. We have here some additional poll questions. Yeah, correct. So if you could help us here, to respond to this, what's the key barrier for your organization to implement, decentralized clinical trials? If you can add that, it'd be fantastic. And then we can also use this, and take it, further in our conversation here, in our webinar. Okay. With no further ado, I will then ask, if you go to the next slide, please, and we'll handle it over to the next speaker here, talking about optimizing clinical trials to maintain accuracy of evidence. Bill,
Great.
if you can take over, that'd be fantastic. I appreciate it. Thank you.
Thanks, Gunther. And yeah, hello, everybody. Nice to see you, and thank you for joining. Of course, this webinar is, of course, all about decentralized clinical trials. I just want to introduce myself. I'm Bill Byram. I'm the VP of Product Intelligence and Positioning here at Signant Health. But I'm also one of our eCOA scientists, providing sort of scientific expertise into what we do here, particularly on the eCOA side of our business. I've got interests in decentralized trials, also in eCOA and wearables. And I'm a member of the Scientific Leadership Board of the Digital Medicine Society, and also an active member of CPATH's eCOA Consortium and ISPOR as well. So really great to be here. If you go to the next slide, please. So yeah, we're talking about decentralized clinical trials, and I think DCT is a relatively new word, but it's not a new thing. So, you know, in optimizing clinical trial solutions and conduct, you know, we as an industry have been decentralizing aspects of our clinical trials for many years. And at the end of the day, you know, a clinical trial is a clinical trial, and it relies on the same things, however you conduct it. It relies on accurate and reliable measures of efficacy and safety from which to make robust conclusions and decisions. It relies on patients and investigators and investigational product. And it increasingly leverages technology to drive endpoint quality, and also to enable and simplify processes and participation for sites and patients, and to collect more data and more information on our interventions remotely. So at Signant, when we think about DCTs, we actually think more about optimizing clinical trials. So enabling the right data to be collected at the right time, with the right solution, and in the right setting. And how we optimize a clinical trial depends on many aspects of the study. So it's the study design, the disease indication, the things we want to measure and the concept of interest in the protocol, the characteristics of the patient sample, so things like age and physical and mental capabilities of the patient, the geographies involved, and so forth. And all of those factors become components of how we might optimally construct a solution for a clinical trial. And we use a variety of technologies and technology configurations based on these to optimize our clinical trials, and to optimize our processes and our measurement strategies. And that ensures, you know, those things that we look for in a clinical trial: accurate and reliable clinical endpoints and easy participation for sites and patients. So as you can see on this slide, that this is just some examples of decentralization that we've delivered over the last 20 years. And so just maybe pick on one or two of these before we move to the next slide. So 2007, that was the first central ratings that we performed using independent central raters who would sit aside from the site and assess patients via video recordings of site assessments. In 2015, using the same video technology to enable remote ratings for sites to perform via video connection with patients, instead of asking the patient to come into clinic, to actually have them at the other end of the video and perform that very same complex ClinRO assessment over video. In 2018, there in the middle, you can see our first direct-to-patient medication supply study. And then more recently, 2020, capturing sort of new and novel endpoints. So using the same technology that we provide to patients to collect their patient-reported outcomes data, we can collect other novel endpoint data like photographic endpoints, for example, where they use the camera in the smartphone to collect images that can then be assessed centrally by an investigator. And then finally, also in 2020, our first completely remote e-consent study. So I think, as you can see, what we're trying to paint the picture here is, you know, we've got a real interest in DCTs, but we also acknowledge that, you know, decentralization is something that we've been doing for quite some time. If you go to the next slide, please. I think maybe just to build on what Gunter said about, you know, the technology solutions and associated services that we have at Signant, you know, they apply to however we want to conduct a clinical trial, and that enables us to optimize trials in the right way. So you can run a completely traditional trial with our platform, so with site-based, completely site-based assessments. You could have a completely remote trial, or you could have something in the middle with less site visits and more things being done at home in a hybrid setting. The platform enables all of those things. And it's underpinning that platform are four components. The first is evidence generation. So Gunter talked about this. This is the eCOA, the electronic clinical outcome assessments. And that would include data from wearables and sensors as well. The drug supply, so it's an important part of decentralized trials, is making sure we can get medication to patients at home. And it's often overlooked when we think about DCTs. Again, our solution enables that last mile delivery of medication to patients. Then it's the enabling solution, so the glue that kind of makes studies work. So things like electronic informed consent, patient engagement, telemedicine, and those components. And then finally, we'll touch on this later in the presentation, the scientific aspects, making sure that what we're measuring is still accurate, still reliable, even if we're now measuring it in a different way and we've adapted to do it in a different setting. So if you go to the next slide, please. And I think as we look at decentralized trials, we see a number of things that are important for successful DCTs. The first, of course, is good technology, and the technology needs to have all the features that you need without any capability gaps to run a DCT. The second is scale, the ability to have, the architectural and operational capabilities to operate these studies at scale. At Signant, we've got 1,100 live studies on our servers at the moment. The third piece is medication management. And as I said, I think when people think about DCTs, they often think about eCOA, eConsent, and telemedicine. And rarely does the supply piece come into the discussion. And yet that's a really important piece, making sure that we're not simply bringing patients into clinic because we want to dispense medication, but being able to provide them that medication at home where that's appropriate. The scientific expertise, so ensuring the high quality clinical evidence is maintained through good measurement strategy throughout in the way that we design the study. And then service, and as we think about things like eCOA, service isn't just about project management, it's about things like logistics and being able to get devices around the globe easily. It's about managing the licenses and the authors involved in the different measurement scales that we might be using in that clinical trial. And then finally, we're seeing more and more sources of data being collected in clinical trials. As we collect more information in our studies, we're going to be doing more things remotely. We're going to be using more sources of data. And of course, as we decentralize more, the same is true. And so we're going to see a continued increase in the number of sources of data that we see in clinical trials. Being able to pull those sources together, aggregate the data, and provide a full view of the whole data throughout the clinical trial means that we can provide some real advantages and insights that are important for managing those clinical trials. So you go to the next slide, please. So what I wanted to do is just show a few examples of decentralization to maybe spark the thinking around what makes what's important in terms of maintaining accuracy of measurements. And so this first example was something that we actually did as a response to the COVID pandemic. We had a very large Alzheimer's trial. And this was across 12 countries, 1,800 patients. It was all based around site visits for this particular clinical trial. And of course, the pandemic hit, it made movement very difficult. It meant sites weren't willing to take patients in for certain types of visits. And so we adapted the trial. So from a study where we had patients coming into clinic to receive their infusion of medication and also to be assessed with the complex ClinROs like the UPDRS and various other scales that we'd be using in that trial, we moved that to a completely remote scenario where we worked with a third party to provide a home nurse. We did the direct-to-patient medication provision. The nurse would provide the infusion of the the infusion of the drug to the patient. The nurse would also be responsible for setting up the technology so that the video interaction between the patient and the investigator could happen, and they could have that assessment done over the video. And this was all done in a way to manage and maintain good measurement science and good equivalence of the measurements that we're doing at home versus the measurements we were doing in clinic. If you go to the next slide. Now here's an example of some of the things that we look at when we're wanting to demonstrate that consistency of measurement, even when we start to change the way that we measure things. So in this example, we're looking at one particular endpoint, and we're looking at a statistic called the mean square successive difference. And that's a useful statistic. It's a measure of variability, but it takes account of gradual shifts from the mean in a variable. So you tend to, it's a good variable if you've got a response, an endpoint that is changing gradually. Maybe you're getting a gradual improvement over time. So something like a depression rating, for example. And this is a good way of, one way certainly, of looking at consistency of the data. And you can see in this graph, if you just look at the blue bars as an example, we've got, these are the study sites that were outside of the USA, the rest of the world. And you've got the in-person assessments in the dark blue and the remote assessments in the lighter blue. And you can see the distribution of those mean square successive differences are pretty similar. So we're seeing similar consistency of the values, independent of whether it was done over video or face-to-face. And that's only one statistic that we look at. And our scientists will look at a number of different aspects of the data to provide evidence for the validity and the equivalence of the measurements done in these different ways. If you go to the next slide, please. So as we kind of think about how we might convert scales into different settings, from sort of site-based to video-based, for example, we might want to think about two examples. If we think about a Hamilton scale for depression, this is a scale that's assessed using a psychiatric interview that usually lasts about 20 to 30 minutes. Patients are assessed against 19 different aspects, or 19 items on that scale, different aspects of depression. And the interview is used, it's a structured interview that the investigator will follow to tease out the score against each of those 19 items. Now that's very applicable. The types of questions that are being asked, the things that are being looked at, very applicable to use over video as well as face-to-face. And in fact, the only sort of non-verbal cues that the investigator might pick up might be things like speaking rate, intonation, or the facial expression, and all of that you can actually assess over video. Compare that to a UPDRS, the Parkinson's rating scale. Many components of that scale can be assessed in the same way that we've just described, but there are other aspects of that rating scale that make it difficult. And so things like assessing muscle rigidity, etc., are very hard to assess without physically being there with the patient, be able to touch the patient. And so we need to think carefully about how we adapt these scales for use in remote settings. Can you go to the next slide, please? But there's a lot of evidence out there in the literature, and here's a few examples, some of which our scientists have produced, and some of which come from other academic centres. And these show the equivalence of video-based versus face-to-face based ClinROs, these clinician ratings, for different types of diseases and different types of rating scales. And there's a growing body of evidence supporting the equivalence in certain types of diseases and for certain rating scales. If you go to the next slide. And I think maybe just again, as we think about accuracy and maintaining accuracy of evidence, independent of how we start to measure things, I think one important question we need to ask is, in doing something from home, are we actually starting to measure something different to what we're measuring in clinic? And here's just an example of two performance outcome tests that we might want to consider. So think about a postural stability test. So this is a test where a patient might be standing still, and we're trying to assess how much sway their body's producing when they're trying to stand still for a period of time, maybe 30 seconds. You could do this in the clinic, and the investigator could instruct the patient how to stand. They could assess them, or they could put a sensor or wearable on them and get some data from that. Alternatively, and we're seeing, in some clinical trials, patients are being asked to do this themselves at home. Maybe they're using an app, It might be using the sensors on the app, or it might be using a wearable and having the app to guide them through the assessment. And because it's unsupervised, we're likely to see a little bit more variability in that data because it's less standardized. You know, they may be not standing with their feet exactly the right distance apart each time, etc. And that could cause a bit more variation. But it's unlikely that doing the test that way is going to provide a significant bias in the estimates that we produce. And in fact, the fact we can now measure more frequently might mitigate this greater variability we might see in the data. Compare that to a 6-minute walking test. And this is a test that's conducted in clinic and where patients are asked to walk as quickly as they can and cover as much distance as they can in 6 minutes. And because they're supervised, they've got a nurse there with them, you can really get them to push the speed as much as they can. Now, if they're doing that at home, you wouldn't want them to be exercising to that level of intensity. You just want them to walk for 6 minutes at a comfortable pace because they're unsupervised. And so actually, you're not measuring quite the same thing. You're not measuring intensity, but you are measuring some sort of walking capacity measure, but they're slightly different. And so I think as we think about how we convert measures for collection of data at home, we need to think about this question about, are we measuring something that's the same as what we were measuring before in the clinic? And if we're not, does it matter? You know, are we actually measuring something that's more important or more pertinent to the clinic-based measure? So I think at that point, I'd like to pass over to Darby, who's going to continue this journey to talk about what makes sense to patients and sites. So over to you, Darby.
Thank you, Paul. So first of all, so my name is Darby Wessels. I'm the Chief Medical Officer of Signant, and I've got a group of the scientists in Signant as well as the clinicians reporting into me. My so my background is I worked a lot with sites. I worked a lot directly with patients. And I would like to talk today about what makes sense to patients and sites in the DCT setting. So, and like one of my colleagues used to say, why wonder about something if you can know about it? So let's move on to the next slide. So first of all, about patient attitudes and perceptions, most of my, I want to look into this study here because I think it's a very well represented study. It was a survey of almost 12,000 respondents. 70% of them in North America, about 3% in South America, 19% Europe, and then the rest in Asia Pacific and Africa. And then if you actually look at the male, female, and other genders, basically ratios, it's very representative of what we would see in our trials, maybe a little bit more females than normal, and the same with the age ranges. Similarly, when we look at the ethnicities, so it's 74% white, about 8% of Black or African American patients or volunteers to the trial. And then the rest Asian. There's also about a third Hispanic population. And half of these people have participated in clinical trials. So that's why I thought this was a pretty interesting study to talk about today. If we go to the next slide. So the first part is just about the visit type flexibility and whether we need to provide options for study visits. And this is basically whether you want to come into the trial or not. And when we look at this, the majority of the patients want those options. So they either, if you look at it, 90% of the total respondents either said it's very important or somewhat important. And this is important. This is pretty much the same whether they've participated in a clinical trial or not. So it is important for people that they want the option to go to the clinic. And from my experience, there's a lot of reasons for that that's valid. The first one is people really want to actually go and see what this organization looks like, where they're going to commit their time and their safety to over for the next up to 5 years. They want to also be able to have that ability to sit down face to face with the physician, and then also with other people to actually ask questions. And some people are just more comfortable with that. And it is so. I think when you look at this and you want to think about it from a clinical trial, it's really important not just to go for a decentralized trial, but think about your patient population, think about the area where they are in, and not just make the assumption that we all like using technology and we all used to do things in Zoom, and therefore we'll all be happy to participate in a clinical trial with patients. So that's the first part that I want to talk about here. So if we go to the next slide. And this is just a quick one, and this is how willing you would be able to participate in each of the following type of research trials, and whether you collect all your data and whether you collect some of your data. So the majority of the patients are open to hybrid trials. And when you look at this, it's also the majority of patients are open to collecting all their data. That's what we want to look at this. But if we go to the next slide, which is the next question is, so even though the majority of the people are comfortable to do this, especially some of your minority ethnicities do have some concerns about their rights being infringed. So privacy, confidentiality, especially among the Black and African American respondents, were still an issue here, that they feel not comfortable of using these type of technologies, not comfortable about sharing all their data, and then also thinking about costs around it. So we feel, even though we are a technology company, we feel you really have to think about how you're going to handle the your diversity site population strategy here, and it comes back to that people are comfortable with it, but they do want that choice. They want that choice to be able to do something either at home or come into the site. So, and make sure that you have a very specific diversity strategy that will address some of these concerns that people may have where you do offer your trials. So I think that's these are the main points that I wanted to point out about patients. So if we go to the sites as the for the next slide, this is a study and a white paper that was written by one of my colleagues, Katie Gardner. And what she did is she actually reached out to sites after a large bring your own app device ePro versus a provider device, and asked them some detailed questions about that. The majority of these sites were in the US. There were 2 of these sites in Sweden, and then 2 of them in Poland. And yes, I just want to share some of the key learnings to you. If you're interested, we can share the white paper with you as well. So the first thing is that the sites leave, if there is a choice, and it's not just bring your own, the sites will leave that choice to the participant. And what you can see is that the patients do, if they own a device, if they own a smartphone device, they actually do choose getting it to their own devices and just downloading it. The sites also prefer this because of a lot of advantages to it. First of all, they don't have to manage the inventory or store the devices. And then secondly, they don't have the challenges with uploading the data afterwards, patients forgetting their devices when they come to visit the sites, or losing any data. But you have to remember about 15% of the sites that we spoke to, they said that some patients don't have smartphones. So what we would like to say here is that you have to leave some devices open for a global study and any large type of study. So just doing it, bring your own, you're going to exclude some patients from your trial. And therefore it does make sense to ensure that you have the logistics and infrastructure to ship those devices globally for these trials. Like I said, if there's any other questions about this, we're very willing to share this white paper with anyone. Then my final slide, which is the next one, I just want to show the need for advice with these solutions. And we strongly believe that these clinical trials are not just about the technology. And this is a case that I just want to show to you. This was a study that we did in, it's a pediatric study that we did in attention deficit hyperactive disorder patients. And the challenges of the study was that, and this was an e-consent part that we did. And the challenges of it is that we had to obtain signatures from both the pediatric patients as well as their legal representatives. And we have to use two different character sets based on the age of the readers, because different readers have different abilities to process the information. And then we have to have 8 unique consent forms on this trial. So we met with the clients and made sure that we included multimedia to keep the patients engaged. We tracked the status changes of all these different consent forms. And then finally, we created separate access for the child versus their legal representatives. And we were able to sign the majority of these signatures electronically. The majority of the sites liked it, and the majority of the sites like that more versus the traditional process. So there are ways to do this, but what we want to make sure is that you just keep these things in mind. It's not just about the technology. You have to have the advice of an experienced person when you're running these studies. So I'm going to hand over to Emil now, who will be the next speaker for us. Thank you.
Thank you, Davi. Hello, everybody. My name is Emil Høgh. I'm based in Denmark, and I work as a solution consultant across eCOA, telemedicine, and e-consent here at Signant Health. And prior to Signant, I've been around academic research. I worked as a study coordinator at a dedicated research site, and also worked with strategic site relationships at several CROs. So thanks, Davi, to bring the site perspective into this as well. We've managed to take a rational look at decentralized trials through the lens of what really gives us reliable endpoints when we move to a remote setting, and importantly as well, what really does make sense to site staff, what makes sense to study participants. And I think hopefully we've managed to underline that it's not just about slapping technology on any trial out there, but rather it's to make a true difference with technology. It's mainly about science and understanding what really makes sense to your end users, and what does it mean when you do take certain assessment into a remote setting. So I'd like to take a moment here to consider what makes sense to sponsors, what makes sense to study teams. Yes, let's get the poll up while I speak. When it comes to how we actually implement these technologies, because a lot of these technologies are still at the adoption phase. I can't believe e-consent still is, but here we are. And telemedicine is another sort of adoption stage, remote enabling technology, I would say. I think a lot of sponsors have dived into telemedicine the past couple of years, whereas the consent is just much more scrutinized, and there's a lot more worrying considerations there. So understandable for each. I would like to see how you have seen these technologies be implemented in your own experience. So who actually owns these technologies? Who decides which technology to use? who pays for the technology? Is this the site? Is it the sponsor? I think we have the wrong poll up, but anyway, the joy of technology is not easy for us either, even though we're a tech company. All right, good to know. Good to know though. Great. All right. So in terms of, we often have this, who actually decides which technology to use? Is it the site? Is it the sponsor? A lot of sites are frustrated that sponsors are mandating a technology when we already had one on site, and sponsors get frustrated to manage 100 different solutions on a single study, right? So the right answer to the question which to use really lies somewhere in the balance between what's easy to use for sites and what is manageable and what can the sponsor realistically oversee during the course of the study. So should the sponsor be centralizing decisions around the management of technologies around themselves of the study, or should they, really mandating one technology for all sites to use? Or should the sponsor allow each site to choose their own technology, and what would the implications of this be? I'm not sure if we have the poll up in the background. No, we don't. That's all right. We'll forge ahead. Let's move the slide forward then. Oh, I'm sweating as well. I know. All right, perfect. So great. So I personally come from a site background, and to me, there is definitely something noble about allowing investigators and site staff to use the technology they feel is best for their staff and for their patients. After all, they should know best themselves, right? And if you speak to sites at all, you probably know that password management and technology training and everything is a part-time job by now. I think we all got a little frustrated when EDC came along, and it's just never stopped since, has it? So if at all possible, to me personally, allowing sites to choose what the right, allowing sites to choose is to me the right thing to do, at least. We do see that a lot of our customers feel the same, especially when they are early on in the adoption stage of a new technology. And we've been part of this journey with our clients. And what many find out, some sooner than others, is that, well, somebody's going to have to submit this patient-facing user interface and user guides and notification text to the ethics committees, just like we do with our ECOA, with our patient, with our patient engagement materials and everything else. And if there's a software update and the UI changes and there's different information presented to the patient, somebody needs to know so that someone can resubmit this to ethics. So the burden does increase as the size of the study increases, especially on this part here. And then there's the point of oversight, where somebody want to be able to oversee the study at the study level, whether it's compliance with the technology or its KPIs, and somebody wants to have an audit trail of all the interactions that the patient has with the technology. And these are some of the considerations that we see our sponsors would make, and we help our sponsors make these considerations, at least try to make them aware of them. And at this point in time, there's generally three things that determine what really happens next. And it's one, is this technology used for critical study activities? For instance, is it used to generate primary or secondary endpoints? What is the size of the study? Really meaning, how difficult would this be to manage? And then the last point is, how much is the sponsor willing to invest in site convenience? And here, you could allow 100 sites to have 100 different technologies, and you would have to see what reports you could run from them and run them together, maybe have some middleware to make it all reportable. I think those are some of the key factors we've seen in this question, whether we allow sites to choose themselves or whether we have to mandate something for them. So as an example here, let's say that a study uses a clinician-reported outcome validated for remote use. You can stay on that slide, that's okay. The protocol states that the site should use video and audio communication for the remote ClinRO assessment, right? And here we're actually quite lucky because the regulators help us a lot in making this decision. Back during the pandemic, the FDA actually provided some guidance on this less than a year ago, even though the pandemic feels a little further away now, in my mind at least. And basically they say that to the extent feasible, sponsors should ensure that the methods and the conduct of remote assessments are consistent across sites, trial participants, and visits to really minimize variability in the data. So don't call the patient one day, FaceTime them another, and Teams them at another time. The FDA recommendation is if you're using this to generate data in this way, you should streamline the experience across the trial. So in this case, we usually expect the sponsor to mandate a technology for all sites to use. And yeah, past me cringes a bit, but there's just hoops we have to jump through in research. If that's news to anybody, I'm sorry to hear that. So let's take another example. Let's say you have a small study. You're running 5 sites in the UK, for instance, or the US, doesn't matter. And telemedicine in this case is part of the protocol, but it's not used to generate endpoints. So the sponsor's consideration here should be around, again, the IRB submissions. Yeah, they could allow the study teams to manage 5 different submission packages, basically 1 for each site, each with their own set of user guides, screenshots, notification text from the site's chosen technology. That could be Teladoc, it could be Zoom, or WebEx, and they could be all right doing so. Maybe the sites needs a follow-up or 2, but they could get there. There's a lot of things we get from sites anyway. They would also have to ensure that any changes to the UI during the study is communicated and shared with the IRB, because software updates just happen. And when you're using, at a site level, you very, very rarely have control over the software updates, at least unless you're going for a full telemedicine platform, which, great. On the reporting and oversight, if you want study oversight, again, we could run reports and then combine those reports and hope that there are enough reports available to really get a good overview. But again, if you're using Zoom, WebEx, and FaceTime, there may not be reports available to pull. And then again, there's the labor on the site to actually extract the data. So again, it really decides if you need that oversight. The sponsor have to basically see, could we achieve it through another method? Could there be something in the other systems that indicates something took place? Or can we accept just not having oversight in this respect? So these are some of the considerations we see our clients making as they're taking their steps, baby steps, but also later steps into using these technologies here. We can go on to the next slide. Great. So let's take another example, and hopefully this will not cause any PTSD or anything with any attendees here. But let's say you're running a global study with around 100 sites, let's say 20 countries, and the sponsor wants their sites to use their own telemedicine technology. Put you in the shoes of a study coordinator, a clinical trial lead here for a moment. And this could be Zoom, this could be WebEx, it could be FaceTime or Teladoc. And let's say again, the telemedicine is not really used to generate endpoints, so there's nothing, regulatory-wise that really mandates specifically written out in stone that you should be streamlining this across the sites. So for an ethics submission, at best, it'll be impractical for the sponsor to ensure screenshots are submitted. And what we sometimes have heard about is just not submitting, which I think is very contrary to the way we usually manage any patient-facing materials in our trials. And I think that's a practice that either has subsided or will subside very, very quickly. But basically, you're going to have 15 different, let's say you have 15 sites in Canada, you have 15 different materials for Canada, same in Mexico, same in the US. You have a Cambrian explosion of different technology screenshots to manage as the study grows and takes hold. Also, with the study, if one site has an update, sponsor needs to be aware so they can communicate the update to the patient interface to the IRB. So the IRB is basically there to make sure that everything that the patient sees is appropriate. And while we could expect that Zoom is not going to make an update that says, we'll be curing you now, there's a reason why we have to check, and there's a reason why we have to submit. So as you can see, it won't just be one set of materials per country, it'll be one set of materials per site. Once again, if it was impractical before with 5 sites, get reports out, run them together, get that study oversight, it's just going to be wildly impractical here. It's going to be very financially prohibitive to do the work required to gain oversight, at least from the site telehealth systems in this place here. So we can really see that as the study increases in size and complexity, the cost of effort of allowing sites to use their own technology increases, at least here where when it's patient-facing technology, basically. So as I said initially at the beginning, the right decision often lies in the balance between what's convenient for sites and what is a sponsor able to effectively manage and maintain oversight of. Right, next slide, please. So let's have a look at how sponsors can make it easier for themselves by streamlining technology used on the study, across all the sites in all the countries. So instead of the sponsor managing each site's individual technology submission materials, they should expect this technology vendor to provide all patient-facing screens, notification text, and user guides for submission. So a lot of burden is taken off the sponsor, and a single vendor can generate the materials quite easily. That means there'll be an English version established with the corresponding localized materials for each country. So you end up with one for Canada, one for Mexico, one for UK. And while there are site-specific materials in most submissions, having that managed is just a huge benefit. Importantly, the sponsor will not have to follow up with sites who have not yet submitted the materials, and software updates are also in their control. You can go on to the next slide as well. So by implementing a centralized technology here, the sponsor can ensure that the methods and the conduct of remote assessments are consistent across any country, any site, and for any patient in order to minimize the data variability. They won't have a bias in certain regions due to the different technologies being used. This means that the patient experience is streamlined both through the harmonization of the technology being used, but also from the way that sites are being trained to engage patients by a single vendor. Managing ethics submission packages becomes feasible again. The sponsor can rest assured that the package is up to date throughout the study. And finally, the telemedicine platforms that are built for clinical research, you should expect as sponsor to be provided with oversight of compliance and established KPIs at the study level, as well as having a full audit trail of any patient and site interactions with the platform throughout the study. So hopefully that was helpful. I think I did see a few questions come into the Q&A, and I think that's about the time to get to those. We have about 8 minutes left.
Yeah. So thank you, Emil. So there have been a couple of questions that have been sent to us through the Q&A area. So the first one, though, with supply chain issues, how can Signant platform be flexible to account for study product delivery delays? For example, can extra run-in diaries be disbanded until the delayed study product arrives? So I don't know, Bill, if you want to take that one as the first one, please.
Yep, sure. So it's an interesting question. There's lots of ways to answer this question, so I'm just trying to think of the best way. But I think maybe one thing to say is, of course, when you use something like randomization and trial supply management solution, it's still not a magic bullet. If you don't have enough medication in the supply chain, you don't have enough medication in the supply chain. But certainly, when you do use an RTSM solution, you can operate a study on less medication than you perhaps would with traditional, site-based, when you're just sending stock to site. So you can have less wastage and less overage. So you can run studies on leaner solutions. And then even within that, there are solutions we can use to run things even leaner if we need to. But I think in the context of direct-to-patient shipment, there's kind of two things to think about. So one is we're introducing another delivery phase, from depot to patient directly. So there's an additional delay we need to think about, and we need to accommodate that in the way that we resupply the patient. So we build that into the time frame that we need to have to get drug to patient. But the flip side of that is there's more flexibility, because now you're controlling supplies for many sites from a single point, a single lot of inventory, perhaps at a central pharmacy or a local depot. And so you've now got much more flexibility in the way you use supplies. And that can lead to much more efficient usage and much less chance of running out of supplies. So it's an interesting point. I maybe didn't answer Adam's question completely there, but apologies if I didn't. We can come back to that.
Okay, perfect. Appreciate that, Bill. And then there was a second question. So the question was, do you think it's inevitable that we will have more different data sources with decentralization? is there anything we can implement in trial design to minimize the number of data sources and therefore simplify data aggregation? That's a very good question.
Yeah, I think this theme that we're seeing of more data sources isn't necessarily a decentralization thing. I think actually we're just trying to learn more about our interventions, and there are more technologies and ways of making measurements that enable us to get richer data. So, there's a more interest in using wearables, etc. As one example. So it's not necessarily just a DCT thing, but I mean, for sure, I think as we design trials, and I'm sure Darby would probably comment on this as well, with his team, the way that they look at protocols when they get involved early on with a sponsor to try to help design a protocol, you need to think of that in mind. We've got to keep the experience simple for patients and sites. And so, having lots and lots of different data collection vehicles being used by a patient in their home is just not practical. So selecting things to make sure we're doing the most important things, or selecting devices that can make multiple measurements so we can do more than one thing with a single device. All of those things kind of play into the thinking perhaps about how we might optimize a solution for that study.
Okay.
Oh, Darby, did you want to add to that at all?
Yeah, I just want to say that's exactly the kind of things that we will discuss with you during the design process for your trial, and why it's important to speak to us before the protocol's finalized, because you have to really think carefully on whether you need that data and not just measure it because you can, and what the outcome's going to be of that data. So yeah, and that's why we have to have the discussion. So
okay, perfect. Thank you, Bill. Thanks, Darby. There was another question, I think it's for you, Darby. Is what resources are available to help write protocols for decentralization if we've never done remote trials before? I think it's a perfect question for you.
Yeah, so we've got a group of about 20 scientists and physicians with years of experience, not just in doing clinical trials, but doing ECOA, EPRO, all these clinical trials. And these advisors will help you basically tell what is practical, what is doable, and actually what are your options to do this, and how you can actually minimize the variability of your trials, which is the main reason why we're doing why we're in this, is to make sure that the difference between the signal and the noise is there. Mm-hmm. So please reach out to us. Like I said, it's in all different therapeutic areas. We've got years of experience of scientists as well as physicians, and again in pediatrics as well, like I said. So Joan Bushner, who's part of our group, she's been working in pediatrics her whole career. She's been on the other side, being on an IRB, looking at this from a IRB point of view. So we have all that clinical experience to help you with it. Okay, perfect. Thank you, Darby. I think there's time for one more question here. And Bill, I think that's for you. The question is, we'll start with the first one, then multiple questions in one. How do you manage the release of system updates like EQR when there are changes to the protocol that impact these types of assessments? I think you're mute, Bill.
Yeah, sorry, I was muted. Yeah, I think what this is getting at is, if we have to make a change to an ecosystem, or actually any system, mid-study, how do we roll it out? Because we've got different ethics approvals, different ethics committees providing approvals at different times. And so it's not as simple as simply just producing an update for everybody on the same day. And yeah, our systems are geared up for that. So we're able to roll out updates on a site level, for example, so that we can make sure that just the right patients are getting it at the right time. So depending on the information we get about the ethics approval. So love to talk some more about that. I know we're out of time, but it's an important thing to get right. But certainly we have processes to manage that effectively.
Okay, so I think that covers most of it, and I think we are just in time. It's now 4 o'clock my time, and different time zones, different timing. So I want to thank you, everybody, on behalf of the entire Signant Health team, the organization, to participate in this webinar. At the same time, I want to remember you that we have the next one is coming up on June the 29th, the same time, 3 o'clock Central European time. We talk about randomization and clinical supply management, the journey of a study. We talked today, or in the question, there have been some questions, but I strongly recommend that you also attend that next webinar. And again, we will come back with the answers to your questions in a separate as well. And thank you very much, everybody. I wish you good the rest of the day and have a good week and stay safe and healthy. Thank you and goodbye.
Thank you. Bye-bye.
Thank you.